Hello, I'm John Sweetenham, the Associate Director for Clinical Affairs at UT Southwestern's Harold C. Simmons Comprehensive Cancer Center and host of the ASCO Daily News podcast. Today, we'll be discussing the use of biosimilars in oncology. These are licensed biological products that are largely analogous to the US FDA-approved originator or reference products. And a recent report from an ASCO Expert Panel found that biosimilars may be an affordable and effective alternative to their reference biological products for cancer care. Dr. Zeina Nahleh was the co-chair of the expert panel that clarified the potential value and utility of biosimilars in oncology, and I'm delighted to welcome her to the podcast today. Dr. Nahleh is a breast cancer medical oncologist who serves as the regional chair of the Cleveland Clinic, Florida Cancer Institute. My guest and I have no conflicts relating to our topic today. Our full disclosures are available in the show notes, and disclosures of all guests on the podcast can be found in our transcripts at asco.org/podcasts. Dr. Nahleh, many thanks for being on the podcast today.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Nahleh, oncology-related biosimilars were first approved by the FDA back in 2015. Could you open up by maybe giving us an explanation of exactly what biosimilars are and how these agents are currently being used specifically in oncology?
So biosimilars for oncology were developed for two purposes, basically, to hopefully decrease the overall costs of care and to improve access to cancer therapies. So the biosimilar, the FDA has a clear definition of a biosimilar. It is a similar but not identical to an already licensed biologic product. So that's really the definition. It's similar in terms of quality, safety, and efficacy. Now, biosimilars are produced in living cells. They are purified. They go through multi-step processes. So they're not really identical to the original product, but they're very similar. And the use of biosimilars, as you mentioned, it started in 2015 as an authorized oncology product, and the FDA has since approved several biosimilar products, and the process to authorize this product, it goes through a rigorous process really of checks and balances, but they are really supposed to be equivalent in terms of safety and efficacy and not meaningfully different from the original reference product.
Thank you. One thing I should have mentioned right up front, and apologize for not doing so, is that, I would certainly recommend that all our listeners take a look at the report that you co-authored with the other members of the panel, because I think, number one, it's, extremely informative in many domains, but I think it really gives an excellent description of the development process of biosimilars and the approval process, which is currently, I think, relatively poorly understood. And on that theme, I think as a member of the panel, your panel report noted that there was a lack of clinician understanding about biosimilars and the utility. And I think that's been reflected in the fact that the uptake of biosimilars in the oncology community has been relatively slow. I think you'd probably agree with that. What do you think are the major barriers to biosimilar use that you found as you reviewed the literature? And when do you think they are an acceptable alternative to the available reference biologics?
There are some barriers for clinicians to utilize biosimilars. For example, it could be lack of fully understanding the way biosimilars are produced, whether they are safe, because their development is not exactly the same. Sometimes they are confused with generic drugs, and they are not generic at all. They are completely different. And some other barriers would be mostly the efficacy, because they haven't been, or the thought is that they are not compared head to head to a reference product, which is a normal way of identifying new cancer or oncology medications, is to go through the phase 3 clinical trials and the usual process for research. So that's a little bit different, the way they approve biosimilars. It could be perceived that there are some inadequate evidence supporting these biosimilars. So there are a lot of misbeliefs that I believe underscore the need for more education. So it's great, John, that you're doing this podcast to clarify some of these questions.
Yes, and in fact, although I don't think it's been absolutely definitely determined for most of the biosimilars, but I do think it's right to say that there are some signals that one or two of the biosimilars may even be superior in efficacy, at least in terms of response rates and so on, to their originator products. And there's been this term around of biobetters. I don't know what the panel's feeling was about that and whether there is, kind of enough of a signal there for us to sort of be thinking very seriously about them being possibly a better alternative to the originator product.
Like you mentioned, the manuscript really goes into some details and illustrates how the process has evolved to approve these biosimilars. So it may not be well known, but really the FDA approval process is very rigorous. It requires a lot of clinical and safety data. And many times, actually, a request for a biosimilar drug is returned or rejected, pending more investigation and more details. So, yes, there are some differences compared to the traditional clinical trial design, but really a lot of information and details goes into these approvals. And whether it's clinical data or safety data or pharmacokinetic, it's really based on a robust data, and many times several clinical trials are required. So you're absolutely correct. And we believe strongly as a panel that the biosimilars available in the US are quite safe and effective. And therefore, ASCO has endorsed the biosimilar use in many of the clinical guidelines.
Right. And one of the things I think perhaps we haven't touched on so much so far is, of course, that for the most part, the biosimilars represent a significant cost saving, both for health systems and also hopefully to patients compared with the reference product. And that in itself brings me on to, what I've perceived as one of the issues that perhaps makes clinicians a little bit nervous about the day-to-day use of biosimilars, and that's this concept of interchangeability. Your report certainly advocated for interchangeability. Could you just describe for our listeners what this actually means, this concept of interchangeability, and why in the report you certainly address this in a pretty favorable way?
Interchangeability has different meanings, but for just to make it simple, unless the biosimilar product is designated to be interchangeable, we still recommend that people do not just substitute a biosimilar for a reference product without notifying the prescriber. So that's different than the generic. Generic is different where the pharmacist can easily switch between the two. So far, we are still recommending that the prescribing provider is notified when a pharmacist is recommending changing the prescription to a biosimilar product. So just to clarify also what's the difference between biosimilar and generic, because I think sometimes there's some uncertainty here.
Yeah.
The generic version of the drug is expected to be identical to the brand name product. They have to be the same. Now, they are manufactured the same way, they are marketed the same way, so they are really the same version of the brand drug. So this is different than the biosimilar. The biosimilar is a biologic agent produced by a living system. It's not manufactured the same way. It's actually not likely to be identical to the brand name product. So this is one of the main principal differences between generic drug and biosimilar, is that the manufacturing process uses different production and purification processes. There are some inherent differences between biosimilars and generic drugs. So there are some unresolved challenges. And in the US, actually, there is no biosimilar that is approved as an interchangeable product. There are some specific guidelines by the FDA for potentially granting the designation of being an interchangeable product. Several states have put in place some guidelines on this. So it is recommended to review each state by state recommendation. But as a whole, we believe that biosimilars can be safe and effective product, but it is still the recommendation of the panel is to communicate with the providing physician if and when a biosimilar is to be replacing the main product. And that's really the recommendation. So far, we don't recommend to use interchangeability without including the prescribing team. Okay, so there are some safety concerns raised, but that's not the issue. The issue is that we believe it is not the same as a generic replacing a brand name. Pharmacy and therapeutic committees have to include the prescribing physician into this conversation.
Thanks. That does help clarify that. And it actually takes me on to my next question, because I think we're getting to this issue of point of care decisions about whether to use a biosimilar, and if so, which one to use. And of course, there are a couple of drivers of that. One of them is the health system itself and its P&T committee and so on, and whether they will approve specific biosimilars. But then the other issue that comes into play, and we've certainly experienced this in our own institution, is the one of insurance coverage. So, as I'm sure you know well, different insurance companies have variable policies and preferences about which biosimilars, if any, can be used in their covered patients. And if you're a physician at the point of care trying to make a biosimilar decision, this makes it very complicated because, it can frequently lead to denials that can result in delays in treatment while this is figured out. Could you comment at all on what decision support tools are already out there or in development for physicians at the point of care to make this an easier process for them and for the patients and to avoid delays in treatment?
So, I have to say that it varies. There is really no standard. Speaking to several colleagues and several institutions, you would hear different responses. But in general, we know that insurance can vary substantially in terms of approving or authorizing certain biosimilars versus others. So that's why there is really no standard, and it is clearly important for all of us as clinicians to check with the pharmacy and with the insurance to make sure that we are delivering the treatment that is most appropriate for the patient based on their insurance. So in many cases, the insurance company would dictate sometimes what biosimilar or what agent they would approve versus another. So in this case, sometimes we are obligated to follow what the insurance is recommending in terms of reimbursement. So it's a complex challenge, I believe, in healthcare. I believe it is important, though, to recognize that biosimilars are safe and effective alternative to the original product. So people should feel comfortable in using these agents. We have outlined in the paper around 17 oncology FDA-approved biosimilar that have been supported by evidence. And these are very safe to use, and they go from supportive drugs like filgrastim to other products. And I think it is important to recognize that the biosimilars are here to stay, and they could contribute, they can improve our care delivery if used appropriately. Now, the question of insurance and the payer, we always have to refer to those to make sure the patient receives do not incur extra cost.
So thanks for that great response. And, you mentioned safety, and perhaps it will be worth just returning to that for a moment. Do you think that there are kind of residual safety concerns around the use of biosimilars that we should be worried about? And do you think that we need more data than we already have to track and monitor the individual biosimilars in a kind of post-marketing environment? And maybe I'll just add on to that a partially related question. And that is, in your own institution, how have you handled the issue of consent to patient consent to biosimilars, and addressing the issues of safety and efficacy with the patients?
I'll start with the consent form. We have developed a process where we can write the biological name of the drug, say trastuzumab, and that should cover also the biosimilar version or any other commercial version. So that should be an acceptable way, at least in our institution, to do this. And of course, we educate the patients. Many times patients expect one product and they see another name, and we try to educate the patients that these are safe and equivalent products and you should have no problem. So it's a lot of education, a lot of communication with the patients, but we are able to provide the consent forms in that manner to minimize frequent consenting and doing it many times. Now, going back to the issue of safety, like I mentioned initially, so biosimilars have been developed as a safe alternative, and they are approved after a very rigorous review by the FDA, and they have to exhibit no clinically meaningful differences. So many times they're compared to the original product. They look at their safety, their purity, potency. They look at a lot of criteria, both clinical data and pharmacokinetics. So it goes through a rigorous process, and sometimes it takes years to approve these products. So again, we recommend that the biosimilars used in the US, the FDA-approved biosimilars be adopted, because these have been looked at and validated, and they look at their comparative studies, analytical data, pharmacokinetic. So they compare to the original product, but they also make sure that there is really no deviation in terms of quality and safety. FDA also recognizes some of the uncertainties, and therefore they have also requested post-approval monitoring. And that's important to mention, because post-market surveillance is included in many of these products. So they continue to recommend follow-up on these biosimilars after being approved and in the market. So I hope that covers the question.
I think it does. Absolutely. Thank you for that, and really appreciate your insights. So, Dr. Nahleh, many thanks for joining us on the podcast today. I'd like to, congratulate you and the expert panel for the work that you've done on biosimilars, and for what I think is a great report that really clarifies the use of these agents, and hopefully is going to help over time with the adoption of these agents into oncology practice. I think, there are clear benefits in terms of the cost saving from these agents, both to our systems, but more importantly to our patients. So thank you so much for all of the work you've done. And thanks again for sharing your insights on the use of biosimilars in oncology with us today.
Thanks so much, John, for having me. It's a great pleasure. And thank you for all you're doing. And hope we covered some of these questions. We look forward to more updates from ASCO on biosimilars in the next few months and years to come.
Absolutely. And thank you too to our listeners for your time today. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.